Let's say you had to build a city from scratch. What kind of things would you want to include in your city? Would you put in a really great transportation system? Or maybe you'd want to have a really cool skyscraper in the middle of the city? Maybe you'd want to build a big sports stadium so that you could watch football or soccer or whatever you really like to do. Maybe you'd want the city to have a lot of amazing restaurants or a really, really great water park or something like that. Well, the task of building a city from scratch was one that laid before the saints. Joseph Smith had the location of the city of Zion identified to him in section 57 of the Doctrine and Covenants. Section 58 and section 59 tell him what it was going to be like and what the Lord's expectations were for people that lived in the city of Zion. But first, let's talk a little bit about how they did approach this problem. We have some documents that come from a few years later in 1833 where they laid out what they wanted the city of Zion to look like. For instance, this is a drawing sent in June of 1833 of the design of the city of Zion. And you can see here a few familiar things. For instance, there's a grid system that's laid out so that the city is built according to exact measurements. There's also in the center of the city those three orange lots that you see. The top one was meant to be for bishop storehouses, but the other two were laid aside for the temple. And you might notice that the city itself radiates outward from the square where the temple was going to be. We used this design a little bit later on when we found Salt Lake City, and maybe you've noticed that the streets in Salt Lake are measured outward from Temple Square, whether it's North Temple, South Temple, West Temple, or East Temple. Well, if you're looking at this map, you're going to notice something peculiar, and that is where the temple is supposed to be. There's numbers 1 to 24. Why are there numbers 1 to 24 on the temple block? Because the plan was to build 24 temples at the city of Zion. This is a design a little bit later on, given in August of 1833, that makes it even clearer that the temples were supposed to be at the center of the city, and you can see the temples drawn there. This last one, which came about in November of 1833, also shows the temples. Now, what do we know about these temples? The temples themselves would have looked a lot like what the Kirtland Temple originally looked like. They weren't temples in the sense that we have temples today, because the ordinances we practice in temples, like baptism for the dead, the endowment, and sealing, hadn't yet been revealed. These temples were open spaces where anybody would have been allowed to come in and worship, but had architecture that taught about the nature of priesthood callings and the nature of the priesthood as it existed in the church. On the outside, they would have looked a lot like the Kirtland Temple, but the reason why there was 24 of these temples was they were dedicated to different offices within the church. For instance, the plan lays out that some of the temples would be dedicated to the presidency of the Melchizedek priesthood, or the first presidency, the presidency of the Aaronic priesthood, or the presiding bishopric. There were 3 temples set aside for the high priest, 3 temples set aside for the elders, 3 temples for the priests, 3 temples for the teachers, 3 temples for the deacons. These temples reflect the offices of the church as they would have existed in 1833. It's very possible that if we built the city of Zion today, we might have to expand the temple complex to also include places for things like the Relief Society, the Young Women's Organization, and other organizations that have been added to the church since its founding. The important thing to remember is that the heart of the city was a complex of buildings dedicated to God. And Section 58 and Section 59 of the Doctrine and Covenants really emphasize that it was the principles of living in Zion that were important, and not necessarily the plan of the city. The plan came by revelation and was wonderful, but the first thing that the Savior wanted the people who were going to live in Zion to know was what his expectations were for their own personal righteousness and behavior. So, for instance, in Section 58 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord gives this counsel to the saints. He says, "It's not meet that I should command in all things, for he that is compelled in all things, the same is a slothful and not a wise servant, wherefore he receiveth his reward." He goes on to say, "Men should be anxiously engaged in a good cause, and do many things of their own free will, and bring to pass much righteousness." So the citizens of the city of Zion were expected to constantly be on the lookout for good things to do. The Lord didn't want to have to command them in every little thing or spell out exactly what they were supposed to do all the time. He wanted them to be the sort of people that saw something that needed to be done and used their agency to carry it out. In Section 59 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord gives a loving tribute to one of the most faithful matriarchs in the history of the church, Polly Knight. You remember the Knight family had traveled all the way from New York, where they made their home, to Kirtland, where they were evicted when someone refused to live the law of consecration, and eventually arrived in Missouri. Along the way, the matriarch of the Knight family, Polly Knight, became very ill and worried that she'd die before she saw Zion. She eventually arrived in Zion and passed away only a few days later. And the Lord gives tribute to her in section 59 of the Doctrine and Covenants, saying, "Those that live in the land of Zion, or those that have laid eyes upon the land of Zion, are blessed." The Lord also gives some expectations to people that live in Zion. For instance, in section 59, he says, "Do these things with thanksgiving and cheerful hearts and countenances." The Lord wants us to be thankful for the things that we have and express gratitude for the blessings that we've been given in our life, to express to the people around us that we're grateful and thankful for them. The Lord also emphasized the 10 Commandments originally given to Moses, but he spends a lot of time talking about one in particular that it appears was going to be very important to the citizens of the city of Zion. "And that thou mayest more fully keep thyself unspotted from the world, thou shalt go to the house of prayer and offer up thy sacraments upon my holy day." The Sabbath day was going to be a crucial and critical part of their experience in Zion. That while they labored to build the city, they were also taking time to pause, reflect, build their relationships with others, and build their relationship with God. Now, in the church, sometimes we get a little crazy and a little bit obsessive about the Sabbath day. If you're like me, at a certain point in my life, I tried to compile the definitive list of do's and don'ts on the Sabbath day. What's okay and what's not okay, what's right and what's wrong when it comes to observing the Sabbath. But that's not necessarily what the Lord wants us to go for. Russell M. Nilsson counseled this. He said, "How do we hallow the Sabbath day? In my much younger years, I studied the work of others who compiled lists of things to do and things not to do on the Sabbath. It wasn't until later that I learned from the scriptures that my conduct and my attitude on the Sabbath constituted a sign between me and between Heavenly Father. With that understanding, I never needed a list of do's and don'ts. When I tried to make a decision as to whether or not an activity was appropriate for the Sabbath, I simply asked the question, what sign do I want to give to God? That question made my choices about the Sabbath day crystal clear." So when it comes to living the Sabbath day, the real question is, what sign do we want to give to God? Are we showing him that we're devoted to him and we're devoted to his church, that we're devoted to our family members, our loved ones, that we're trying to become like Christ because we're doing Christ-like things? Or are we pursuing more worldly things on the Sabbath day? The Sabbath can be a tremendous blessing to us if we commit to it and if we do the best that we can to try and figure out what it looks like from Sabbath to Sabbath for us to show a sign to God that we're committed to and that we love him. So, in the land of Zion, people were anxiously engaged. They tried to do the right thing. They tried to be thankful for what they had, and they lived the commandments, including the Sabbath day. Along the way, the people were the most important element when it came to Zion. The buildings, the designs, and the plans will likely all shift in the future as we get closer and closer to the great day when we get to finally build this city. But along the way, it will consist of people that are committed to the commandments, that see God in their lives, and that want to give a sign to God that they're committed to him by following those commandments, including the Sabbath day. When the city of Zion is built, the most important component won't be the railroads or the stadiums or the water parks. It's going to be the people that live there, that love each other, are committed to the gospel, and have one heart and one mind.